Jesse was born in Bethlehem, a small town of little renown, where dirt roads intertwined between simple houses and green pastures, the kind of place no one would imagine as the setting for something great. But God has a habit of hiding epic stories in unlikely places. The son of Obed and grandson of Boaz and Ruth, Jesse had a mixture of tradition and surprise in his blood. Boaz, a respected Israelite, had married Ruth, a Moabite, a foreigner among the people of Israel. It was something that caused suspicious looks, but it was also living proof that God was not limited to human rules. Growing up under this legacy, Jesse learned from an early age that the land was what sustained a man. While the sun scorched the hills of Bethlehem, he plowed the soil, drove the oxen, and looked after the sheep that would provide for him. There were no promises of greatness for him, just the sweat of daily labor, the seasons that came and went, and the years that piled up on his shoulders. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. Time passed, and Jesse became a man of respect. Farmer, cattle breeder, landowner. His name began to be recognized, but not for heroic exploits, just as a prosperous man, the father of many children, the head of a large household, the kind of man the neighborhood looked up to with admiration, but without any indication that his name would echo beyond that small town. There were 8 sons in all, each raised with discipline and harshness. Jesse raised them to be hard-working, to respect tradition and honor the family legacy. He wanted them to be strong, successful, worthy of carrying on his name. And among them, almost unnoticed, was a boy with lively eyes, disheveled hair, and a dreamy manner that stood out from the other brothers. But that wasn't something Jesse had noticed yet. Time passed like the winds dancing over the hills of Bethlehem. Jesse grew older, and his life seemed to follow the predictable path of country men. His name was respected, his house was full of strong sons, and his land produced enough to guarantee a decent living. He was not a warrior, nor a prophet, nor a man of great speeches. He was just a farmer, a breeder of sheep and cattle, someone whose importance was limited to the borders of his own land. The days began early, even before the sun touched the clay roofs of the houses. Jesse toured his fields, supervised the shepherds, and assessed the animals. The flocks were his inheritance and his livelihood. The sheep's wool guaranteed valuable trade on the market, and the milk was used to feed his family. Each animal was counted. Each season brought new worries. Would there be enough food for everyone? Would the rains come at the right time? Would the pests stay away from the cattle? This was the cycle of Jesse's life: work, sweat, and waiting. The kind of life that seemed to have no room for surprises. But fate, that old storyteller, always finds a way to change the plot. Jesse's sons grew up, and he, like any father of the time, began to think about their future. Who would be best suited to carry on his name? Who would have the strength to support the house when his hands were no longer as strong? The eldest seemed the obvious choice. They were tall, robust, ready to wield a sword or take over the family business. The youngest, however, well, that was different. But Jesse didn't worry about that. The boy stayed in the fields, tending the sheep, playing his harp and talking to himself in the wind. He wasn't an important part of the story yet. Or so Jesse thought. The days in Jesse's house followed a well-defined rhythm. The older sons took on important responsibilities, learned to handle weapons, and prepared for a future of conquest. They were strong, disciplined, just as a father expected them to be. Each of them carried a trait of family pride: imposing stature, firm posture, striking presence. There was a silent feeling in Jesse's heart, a desire for one of his sons to do something great, something that would mark the family name in Israel's history. After all, what does every father want if not to see his offspring prosper and be recognized? He knew that times were changing. Saul was king, but rumor had it that God's favor no longer rested on him. Who could have predicted what would come next? Meanwhile, there was the youngest, a boy who seemed out of place among his brothers. David, as he called himself, didn't have the same impressive stature as his elders, nor the same physical strength. While his brothers practiced with spears and swords, he handled a harp and a sling. While they marched confidently among the men, he walked alone in the fields, talking to God under the starry sky. Jesse didn't see him as someone who would play an important role in the great history that was unfolding in Israel. David was just the youngest, the one in charge of the sheep, the dreamy boy who talked about battles no one saw and sang songs no one understood. For Jesse, the eldest sons were the future of the house. They were the ones who would carry on his name, his inheritance, his legacy. But as God himself likes to show, the human eye is always limited. And soon, an unexpected visit would change everything. The day began like any other at Jesse's house. The sun rose lazily over the hills of Bethlehem, and the air carried the familiar smell of damp earth and cattle. Jesse was already up and about as usual, organizing the tasks, distributing orders, making sure everything was in its proper place. There was nothing unusual about the morning until a different murmur began to spread among the servants. Someone was coming. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Samuel, the prophet of God, the judge of Israel, the one who had anointed Saul as king, a man who didn't visit by chance. His name carried weight, and his presence always heralded something great. Jesse felt his heart squeeze. What could a man like Samuel want in his house? Would it be a blessing? A judgment? The possibilities ran wild in his mind as he hurried to welcome him with the reverence that was his due. Samuel entered with his deep-set eyes and serious expression. He had a purpose, but he didn't reveal it immediately. He asked Jesse to gather his sons together because God had chosen one of them for something special. The old father's heart filled with pride. He looked at his sons one by one and with a firm gesture called the eldest first. It was obvious, wasn't it? One of them would surely be chosen. Eliab was the first to introduce himself. Tall, strong, noble-looking. Samuel looked at him carefully, but then looked away. The Lord had not chosen him. Abinadab came next, then Shammah. One by one the sons of Jesse passed before the prophet, and one by one they were rejected. Silence hung heavy in the air. Jesse frowned, confused. All his sons were there, at least that's what he thought, until Samuel asked, his voice calm but firm. "No more young men?" Jesse hesitated. For a moment he didn't even remember. There was one more, the smallest. But he wasn't there. Jesse blinked, not knowing what to say right away. The silence in the room was thick, heavy like the morning fog in Bethlehem. Samuel was still waiting, his question hanging in the air. No more young men. It was then that Jesse remembered. There was one more, the smallest, the most unlikely. "There's still the youngest," he replied, almost without thinking. But then he added, as if that closed the matter, "He's in the field, looking after the sheep." It wasn't an excuse or a lie. David really was far away, among pastures and rocks as usual. It wasn't that Jesse despised him, but David didn't seem to belong at that moment. If Samuel was there to anoint one of God's chosen, it didn't make sense to call the youngest. But Samuel gave no room for questioning. His answer was simple and categorical. "Send for him, for we will not sit at table until he comes." And so a messenger was hastily dispatched. Time seemed to stretch out as everyone waited. The brothers looked at each other suspiciously. What could David have to do with all this? Then, finally, he arrived. David entered the house with his face flushed by the sun, his hair disheveled by the wind, the smell of the countryside still clinging to his clothes. He didn't have the stature of his brothers, nor the posture of a warrior, but his eyes carried a different glow, something hard to explain. Samuel didn't need more than an instant to understand. God spoke to his heart, and the answer was clear. "Arise and anoint him, for this is he." Jesse stood still. What? David? David? The youngest, the sheepherder, the boy of dreams and songs? Before he could say anything, Samuel poured the oil over his son's head. In that instant, something invisible but powerful moved in the spirit world. David's future, and that of the whole house of Jesse, was changing before his eyes. And he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Jesse looked at David, still trying to process what had happened. The holy oil dripped down the boy's forehead, mixing with the sweat of the day's work. It was real. Samuel, the prophet of God, had anointed his youngest son, the youngest, the sheep herder. David's brothers stood motionless, trying to disguise their astonishment. It was hard to accept. Eliab, the eldest, felt the weight of that choice differently. He had always believed that if any son of Jesse was to be called to something great, it would be him. But God doesn't think like men. And Jesse? What did Jesse think of all this? He was undoubtedly proud. After all, his son had been chosen by God himself. But at the same time, there was a thread of uncertainty inside him. How can a father understand something so great when all he knows is simple work in the fields? He had always imagined that his sons would grow up and follow predictable paths. Some would be soldiers, others shepherds, perhaps merchants. But King David seemed no different. As soon as it was all over, he returned to the fields as if nothing had happened. He still had sheep to look after. He still had songs to play on his harp. Perhaps deep down, he himself still didn't understand what it meant. Time passed and life in Jesse's house took its course. But there was something different, something invisible, that not even he could name. It was like a breeze before a storm, like a foretaste of something yet to come. And then one day, Jesse called David, not to look after the sheep, but for another mission. His older brothers were far away on the battlefield, serving in Saul's army. The war against the Philistines was growing in tension, and Jesse wanted news. He gave his son some bread, cheese, and provisions, and sent him to the military camp. A simple delivery, an unimportant task. At least, that's what he thought. Jesse watched David go, not imagining that this would be his son's last day as a simple sheepherder. In his father's eyes, it was just another everyday task. Bringing food to his brothers, hearing the news from the battlefield, and returning home before night fell on Bethlehem. Nothing more than that. But fate, always mysterious, had already mapped out a different path. The battlefield was no place for a boy. Armed men walked back and forth, their faces hardened by war. The smell of iron and sweat hung in the air. David arrived quietly, holding the burden of food that Jesse had entrusted to him, and looked for his brothers. He found them among the soldiers, but before he could even hand over the bread, he heard a shout that silenced the whole crowd. A giant Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, descended into the valley, as he did every morning and evening, challenging the Israelites. His voice was like thunder echoing through the hills. His size, his armor, his arrogant confidence, everything about him made even the most experienced warriors recoil. David looked around, waiting for someone to do something. But fear hung like a thick shadow over the soldiers. No one moved a muscle, not even his brothers. Something ignited inside him, a flame that didn't come from strength or pride, but from something much greater. He clenched his fists. How could that man insult the army of the living God and get away with it? Jesse, at home, was perhaps sitting under the fig tree thinking about his son. Perhaps he expected to see him arrive at dusk, bringing only reports of the war. But David wouldn't come back with words. He would return with something much greater, something that would forever change not only his story, but that of the entire house of Jesse. Jesse didn't know it, but at that very moment, his youngest son was facing an enemy that would make even the most experienced warriors tremble. David, his eyes shining with determination, watched as Goliath challenged the army of Israel, spitting insults and mocking. The giant thought he was untouchable, unreachable, a monster of war that no one dared face. David's brothers tried to silence him when he started asking questions. Who was this uncircumcised Philistine to challenge God's people? Why wasn't anyone doing anything? But David wasn't there to just hand out loaves of bread and listen to empty answers. He felt something growing inside him, not pride nor empty bravado, but an unshakable certainty that this giant would fall. The news that a young man was asking bold questions reached King Saul. What could a boy do against a warrior trained from youth? But David didn't tremble. He told stories that nobody knew. He spoke of the beasts he had faced in the fields, the bears and lions that had come to steal his sheep, and how God had always given him victory. Goliath was no different. Jesse, far away, still saw David as the younger son, the boy of the fields. He couldn't imagine that. While he was taking care of the household chores, his youngest was standing before the king, refusing heavy armor and choosing 5 smooth stones from a stream. The sling in his hand was an old companion. The enemy before him, a giant of more than 3 meters, but in David's mind, the battle was already won. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem, Jesse might have been gazing at the horizon, waiting for his son to return with news of the war. Little did he know that when David did return, it wouldn't be like the boy he had sent that morning. Jesse could never have imagined what would happen that day. Perhaps he would be busy in the fields, perhaps sitting in the shade of an olive tree, thinking about his sons who were at war. His father's heart yearned for them to return safe and sound, unaware that one of them was about to change the course of history. David didn't need a sword. He didn't even put on the armor they offered him. With just a sling and 5 smooth stones in his pocket, he walked down to the valley where the giant was waiting, laughing contemptuously. Goliath mocked him, calling him a boy, a dog, and a fool. But David did not tremble. He responded with words that didn't come from human strength, but from the certainty that God was with him. Then the unexpected happened. The stone flew straight through the air like an invisible arrow. The shock echoed through the valley. The giant fell, as heavy as an ancient tree uprooted. The silence was immediate. The impossible had happened in front of thousands of incredulous eyes, and in an instant, David was no longer just the youngest of the house of Jesse. The news traveled faster than any messenger. The shepherd boy had defeated the greatest enemy warrior with a single stone. King Saul called him near, and the people began to sing his name in the streets. David, the little one from Bethlehem, became the most talked about name in Israel. Jesse saw his son return, but not in the way he had hoped. David was no longer just a boy. He was a warrior, a hero. His father looked at him and realized that something had changed. That same house that had once seemed too small for so many children was now becoming too small for David. And with that came the call to something greater. A new era was beginning, but along with it, a shadow was growing. King Saul, once enchanted by David, began to see him differently. A dangerous glint appeared in his eye, and Jesse, even if he wasn't in the palace, would soon feel the consequences. Jesse no longer saw David so often. The son he had sent as a simple shepherd was now a respected name throughout Israel. At first, there was pride in his father's heart. Who could have imagined that this boy, who had spent his childhood running around the fields of Bethlehem, would now be one of the king's closest men? But pride was soon mixed with worry. Something was changing. The messengers who arrived in the city brought strange reports. King Saul, once so favorable to David, now looked at him with suspicion. There was talk of jealousy and growing fear. The songs sung by the people in the streets only fanned the flames of paranoia in the king's heart. Saul smote his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Words that echoed through the palace corridors like a harbinger of something dangerous. Then came the persecution. From one day to the next, David went from being the king's protege to a fugitive. Jesse didn't know exactly how it all happened, but he knew one thing for sure. His family was no longer safe. It wasn't long before he and his other sons became targets. Anyone connected to David could be seen as a threat by Saul. And so, for the first time, Jesse had to leave his land, abandon his home. He who had always lived simply among fields and flocks now found himself in the middle of a dangerous game, where kings and swords decided the fate of men. David, in the midst of his escape, did not forget his father. He sent Jesse and his brothers to Moab, seeking shelter with the king of that land. Ironic, isn't it? Jesse's lineage came from Ruth, a Moabitess. Now, generations later, it was Moab that offered refuge when Israel could no longer be a safe home. Jesse's life was never the same again. His name, once known only in Bethlehem, was now engraved in Israel's history. He never wielded a sword, never raised a banner in battle, but his lineage would carry something far greater than he could ever have imagined. And centuries later, from that same root, would spring a king like no other. The years passed, and Jesse, well into his old age, perhaps sat many times under the shade of an olive tree, reflecting on everything he had experienced. He began his life as a simple farmer from Bethlehem, a man who never sought glory, never saw himself as part of something great. But God, in his mysterious way, chose his house to change Israel's history. Jesse never wielded a sword, never ruled, never received heavenly visions like the prophets, but he was the father of a king, and not just any king. His son, the smallest, the most unlikely, the one he almost forgot in the field on the day of Samuel's visit, became the man after God's own heart. Did he understand all this in his lifetime? Did he live to see David take the throne? The Bible doesn't tell us the details of Jesse's end, but we do know that his name was never forgotten. His legacy spanned generations, and centuries later, a prophet announced that from the stem of Jesse would be born a new branch, and that branch was Jesus Christ. The story of Jesse teaches us that God sees beyond what man can see. He uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Jesse was just a father who wanted the best for his children, but God used his lineage to bring redemption to the world. We also learn that God's choices don't always make sense to us. Jesse thought that the strongest sons were the fittest, but God chose the smallest, the sheepherder, the dreamer. Perhaps without realizing it, Jesse was a reflection of many of us. We often think that greatness lies in the obvious places, in the most prepared people in the highest positions, but God likes to take the unlikely and turn it into something unforgettable. And so, from a simple man from Bethlehem, a promise was born that would echo for eternity. If you liked Jesse's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.